Good afternoon. I'm Allison LaCroix, professor of law here at the University of Chicago Law School, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this most festive event in the blooming of both spring and legal history in Chicago, the 2013 Maurice and Muriel Fulton Lecture in Legal History. The Fulton Lectureship was established in 1985 through a gift by Maurice Fulton, a member of the law school class of 1942 and an alumnus of the college, and his wife Muriel, an alumna of the college. The lectureship presents a prominent legal historian to speak at the law school. Past Fulton lecturers have included Charles Donahue Jr., Morton Horwitz, John Langbine, Jack Rakove, Gerhard Casper, Sarah Berenger-Gordon, and our own Richard Helmholtz. Today we are especially honored to have with us Mr. and Mrs. Fulton, who along with their family and friends have joined us to celebrate the thriving work of legal history at the University of Chicago, as we celebrate their generosity in helping to ensure its continuation. Now let me say a few words about our speaker today. David Armitage is the Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at Harvard University, where he teaches intellectual history and international history. And if any among you have consulted Professor Armitage's webpage, you will no doubt have noticed the impressive, if somewhat forbidding, array of abbreviations and acronyms following his name. As befits one of the leading scholars working at the intersection of intellectual and international history, Professor Armitage is a corresponding fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, also established by Royal Charter, as is appropriate for a historian of empire. Professor Armitage was born in Great Britain and educated at Cambridge University and Princeton University. He taught for 11 years at Columbia University before moving to Harvard in 2004. He has lectured on 6 continents, and he currently holds an honorary professorship of history at the University of Sydney. Professor Armitage is the author or editor of 13 books, a sampling of which I have here with me today. The Declaration of Independence, A Global History, 2007, which was named a Times Literary Supplement Book of the Year. The Ideological Origins of the British Empire, 2000, which won the Longman History Today Book of the Year Award, and a number of edited volumes, including Milton and Republicanism and Shakespeare and Early Modern Political Thought, which was also a TLS Book of the Year. His most recent book is Foundations of Modern International Thought, which was just published this year. As the very titles and topics of these books suggest, Professor Armitage's work on the history of ideas has direct and important connections for the work of lawyers and legal historians. Professor Armitage has said that his preference is for short books on big topics. And many of these topics, the turn from natural law to positive law in the Declaration of Independence, the history of modern international thought, the writings of John Locke, Jeremy Bentham, and John Milton, the Atlantic context of the British North American Empire and the American Revolution, have produced path-breaking books and essays that have fundamentally reshaped our understanding of some of the most important questions in political and legal thought from the 17th century through today. In 2006, the National Maritime Museum in London awarded Professor Armitage its Caird Medal for, and I'm quoting, conspicuously important work of a nature that involves communicating with the public. And in 2008, Harvard named him a Walter Channing Cabot Fellow for achievements and scholarly eminence in the fields of literature, history, or art. In 2010, Professor Armitage delivered the Wiles Lecture at Queen's University Belfast on ideas of civil war from Rome to Iraq, the subject of his current major book, and of his talk today. He is also working on an edition of John Locke's colonial writings and a co-authored study of the return of the longue durée in historiography. Finally, in a 2012 interview bearing the provocative title, Are We All Global Historians Now?, Professor Armitage commented, as a side note, I should say that I have been struck at various points by how generous extremely senior scholars can be to junior scholars, and how decisive this can be in one's academic life. Throughout my own career, I have tried to follow this example as much as I can in my own faltering way. As a former student of Professor Armitage's, I have been the repeated and grateful beneficiary of this intellectual and professional generosity, which continues to the present day. In that spirit, Professor Armitage is here today, and the topic of his lecture is Civil War, a Genealogy. Please join me in welcoming David Armitage.
Thank you so much, Alison, for that extraordinarily generous and genuinely moving introduction. And also thank you so much to Maurice and Muriel Fulton for endowing this lectureship as well. All of us in history, not just in legal history, know that in many ways our field is embattled, especially in the public sphere. So it's very important to know that it's being supported in arenas like this. So your generosity is much appreciated, not just in this law school, but more generally. And it's an enormous privilege to meet you here this evening. So thank you so much for this endowment. And thank you indeed for the invitation, which I'm certain came entirely by mistake. I am not, nor have ever been, a legal historian, at least in the sense I've never taught in a law school. I do not possess a law degree. I am an historian who has an interest in the law, and indeed I am a lawyer manqué. I always thought in my teens I wanted to be a lawyer, but then got diverted into other things. But I think it's still possible, at least in Britain, to go back and take the bar exam. So maybe inspired by conversation today, you may put me back on the straight and narrow to what I was always meant to do in my teens. Maybe the result of the lecture will be telling me I should give up the whole historical thing and maybe do something more honest instead, but we shall see anyway. But as Alison has already mentioned in listing the roster of former speakers at this podium in this lectureship, any Fulton lecturer stands very much on the shoulders of giants. It was very intimidating to read the list of former Fulton lecturers from great colleagues of mine like Charlie Donoghue and Krista Sand to old friends of mine like Jack Rakove and Sally Gordon. So it's both a privilege and an honor, but in both cases a very intimidating one to be standing before you today, especially as someone who I think is the first historian, that is, member of a history department rather than someone who even has a joint appointment in a law school standing here today. So I hope this is opening a door to other historians interested in history and law and the history of law to speak in this august forum. Again, I feel very strongly about the ability to speak in such a forum because I've been thinking a great deal, again, Alison's already alluded to this, about the place of history, not just in the university ecosystem, but also the place of history in the public sphere, and thinking more and more about the ways in which we can snatch history from the contemporary bonfire of the humanities, the crisis of the humanities within universities in terms of enrollments, but also outside the universities in bringing historical perspective, depth and range and complexity back to public debate. And so the lecture I want to give you this evening is very much in the spirit of that concern about how we can bring historical depth to bear upon contemporary problems in order to clarify in one sense, but also to complexify some of the responses to those issues which may be treated according to the minimalist planning horizons of economists and politicians bound by electoral cycles for the most part, but where I think, and I hope all of you would agree, historical depth is more necessary to understand nuance, complexity, not just the roads not taken, but also the multiple sedimentations of arguments and dilemmas which lie behind contemporary problems. And it's certainly the contemporary problem of civil war, which I want to face in this spirit today. The project which Alison's alluded to, out of which this essay emerges, began in late 2005, early 2006, for me at least, when I was working at the Huntington Library reading the papers of Francis Lieber, who I'll talk about a little later on. Francis Lieber, I think, will be very well known to all of you, and certainly particularly well known now in light of John Witt's masterful treatment of him and his code, or perhaps it was Lincoln's Code, in his recent book, Lincoln's Code. But I was reading Lieber's papers at the same moment in late 2005, 2006, when violence in post-invasion Iraq was going to its greatest height. And at that point, you may recall, there was a debate in the public prints on both sides of the Atlantic, and also in policy circles and in political circles, about exactly what to call the conflict in Iraq. Was it a rebellion? Was it an insurgency? Was it a civil war? As I was reading those reports in the newspapers and listening to journalistic accounts of those debates, I was going back into the Huntington reading room and reading Francis Lieber's tortured attempts to define civil war in the middle of the US Civil War. And again, I'll come back to his attempts to define that. and realized that there was an argument going on there between the middle of the 19th century and the early 21st century about definitions of civil war, that one could see those, I thought, as data points in a longer set of arguments, a set of arguments, as I'll show you today, which I believe go back to Republican Rome. And therefore, this is a key case, for me at least, where the longue durée is absolutely essential to understand contemporary dilemmas, that we need to go back 2,000 years to examine some of the roots of our contemporary dilemmas. And those dilemmas are not going away, of course. Think about the contemporary situation in Syria, which rather naturally at this point in our arguments and in the public prints we describe as a civil war. You may recall that it was only 9 months ago that the International Committee of the Red Cross denominated the conflict or multiple conflicts in Syria as a civil war, because that had implications for the application of international humanitarian law in that particular conflict, again something I'll come back to in conclusion. So what seems obviously to have been a civil war was not obviously such to those with the expertise and indeed the moral responsibility to denominate it as such, and that seemed to be another continuing data point in these discussions. As a commentator on the BBC argued this morning in relation to Syria, if you are not confused about what is going on, then you do not understand it. And I think that may be a very good motto for historians in general. Of course, the famous motto of historians is, it's all much more complicated than you think. And that will be indeed one of the mottos of this lecture as well. We have handy terms to describe these forms of complexity, which reduce complexity, which more parsimoniously help us to understand these contemporary difficulties. But I think as historians at least, and certainly as historians with an interest in law and the way in which law both reduces and multiplies complexity in equal measure, we need to be attentive to terms which have legal bases to them and legal histories, and certainly civil war and its cognates, I think, is again a key example of that, as I hope to show. In a situation like Syria, for instance, it may not matter very much to the rebels, as they've been called by the Assad regime, what their conflict is called, whether it's a rebellion, an uprising, resistance to a tyrant, or a civil war, for instance. But to the international community, it clearly matters a great deal what term is applied to that. If there is an argument, for instance, in Syria, as there was an argument in Iraq, about whether the conflict is indeed a civil war, then the implications do indeed run deep for other powers beyond Syria itself, and not just adjacent countries. The name civil war now accords legitimacy to forces that rebel or resist that they might not otherwise have. To other observers outside, it might counsel distance, as we're seeing the very fraught and perhaps in a fundamental sense irresolvable debate going on in the Obama administration at the moment about whether or not to intervene in the conflict. At least in Iraq, one of the implications of the use of the term civil war was that this was merely an internal conflict of no interest to outside powers that should be allowed to burn itself out at whatever human cost within Iraq itself. I'm not quite sure we're at that stage in Syria, but we're getting close to that stage at the moment. A civil war is someone else's business. It's an internal matter, perhaps a police matter in some constructions of it, that argues against intervention and argues therefore for standing on the sidelines, not getting involved, but also involves very important questions, implied questions, but sometimes explicit questions about who is the legitimate authority, what are the limits of their coercive powers, what are therefore the limits of intervention by outside powers as well. So, as I hope to show, a great deal has always hung upon the use of the term civil war to denominate a conflict, not just in the present, but as Alison and I were discussing before the lecture, I think we as historians, not least, should admit that if not all history is contemporary history, at least we should bear a responsibility for accounting for our work as historians in relation to contemporary problems, and to be honest about the fact that it's often contemporary problems, perhaps contemporary within disciplines, but also contemporary outside disciplines, which drive us to the fundamental questions we find so important. And certainly that's the case for me as an intellectual historian writing about civil war. The contemporary violence, first in Iraq, which was the seed of the project, and now continuing violence in an arena like Syria, is a reminder also of one of the greatest paradoxes of our time that emerges again in the context of a larger historical frame. If we go back to the late 18th century, you'll remember that in 1795, Immanuel Kant forecast that there would one day be what he called perpetual peace. He was more hopeful that peace among states was not what he called just an empty idea, as many of his contemporaries thought, but rather a task which, as solutions are gradually found, constantly draws nearer fulfillment. Barely 200 years later, in fact, humanity may now be finally free, or almost free, of armed conflict between states. In the period 2007 to 2011, for instance, the last 4-year period for which we have very accurate statistics on contemporary conflicts, there was only one interstate conflict anywhere in the world, a brief spat between Cambodia and Thailand over their borders. There are others on the horizon at the moment, of course, but in that period, only one conflict that has been described as an interstate conflict, and I'll come back to why we might have a little skepticism about some of those definitions in a moment. But for the moment, at least, let's take that as a benchmark. The movement towards the death of interstate war has been accelerating since the Second World War, and is sometimes called by historians the long peace of the post-1945 period, as John Gaddis has called it. That long peace has now been followed by what my Harvard colleague Steven Pinker in his most recent book has called the new peace, a peace where violence across the board, all kinds of violence, he argues, has been declining over the long duration. Interstate peace is merely, as it were, the leading edge of that decline in violence. There's been a lot of pushback against that thesis, but at least the book itself is an index of this broadly shared belief now that we are in a post-war world, at least if we understand war in at least one of its classical meanings as war between states. The most striking change in patterns of conflict seen in this perspective in the post-war era has been the shift, in fact, from the war between states to war within states. According to one often cited estimate, there have been 248 armed conflicts around the world since 1945, over half of them since 1989, since the end of the Cold War. Of these, 137 conflicts that have been recorded since 1989, at least 125 of them took place among forces within the territory of a single state, not between sovereign states. And in 2011, 36 out of the 37 active conflicts around the world were of just this kind, that is, within the borders of one sovereign entity. And almost 1/3 of them, it's been calculated, the highest proportion at this point in any year since 1945, also drew in neighboring countries or outside powers to become what political scientists call internationalized civil wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. The global estimate of battle deaths in all of these internal wars since 1945 is about 25 million people. That is roughly half the estimated direct casualties in the Second World War itself. Hard-nosed economists who study global development have estimated the annual price tag for civil war at about $123 billion a year. That is roughly the equivalent of the amount the global north budgets for economic aid to the global south each year. With these broad figures in mind, we might ask if a long agony, especially for the global south, has in fact replaced a long peace, mostly concentrated in the global north. But not for nothing has the Center for the Study of Civil War in Oslo, perhaps rather self-interestedly, proclaimed on its website, civil war is now the dominant form of war in the world. Now, so far, I've spoken as though civil war is a clear and uncontroversial category, at least as it's used in these statistical compilations. We might think it's just like Justice Potter Stewart's famous definition of hardcore pornography. We know it when we see it. A community torn apart, bitter divisions between those who should be closest to one another, large-scale violence, almost unhealable wounds. Surely we need no more than such broad but visible signs to tell us when there is or when there was a civil war. Other kinds of conflict may be less fractious, less fratricidal, and less ferocious, and therefore not civil wars. Won't these criteria help us to say, as Justice Stewart did, of any instance that this case is not that this is a civil war, but that was something else, an uprising or a rebellion perhaps, maybe an insurgency, but not a civil war? That seems unlikely that we can have that kind of immediate intuitive clarity. As one leading scholar of conflict has recently remarked, civil war is a phenomenon prone to serious semantic confusion, even contestation. And I'll make that even firmer in a moment, that not just even contestation, I will argue that it's an essentially contested concept. The description of a conflict as a civil war carries symbolic and political weight, since the term can confer or deny legitimacy to a warring party. The application or withholding of the term civil war depends on whether you're a ruler or a rebel, the victor or the vanquished, an established government or an interested third party. It can also determine whether or in what ways outside powers intervene, as we've seen in Iraq and now in Syria, which international humanitarian laws might apply in a conflict, and hence ultimately who can or cannot be prosecuted for war crimes, and also what international bodies like the World Bank are willing to invest in war-torn countries after civil war or with the prospect of potential civil war looming over them. Like its near neighbour genocide, civil war is an essentially contested category, albeit one with a much longer and more tangled history than that term genocide so painfully coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944. Recovering at least part of the history of civil wars conceptual contestation, will be my task this afternoon. My approach to the question of civil war will be that of an intellectual historian, and I plan to offer what I've called in my title a genealogy of civil war. As the great intellectual historian and my mentor, Quentin Skinner, recently defined this intellectual historical procedure, quotes, "When we attempt the genealogy of a concept, we uncover the different ways in which it may have been used in earlier times. We thereby equip ourselves with a means of reflecting critically on how it is currently understood." The inspiration for this procedure is avowedly Nietzschean rather than Foucauldian, for instance, or more immediately Nietzschean than Foucauldian. The aim is not, for instance, to narrate the history of the idea of civil war, for reasons that Nietzsche classically expressed on the Genealogy of Morality, where he wrote, quotes, "All concepts in which an entire process is semiotically concentrated defy definition. Only something which has no history can be defined." Civil war has a richly contested history, often around exactly the question of its definition, and that history extends over 2 millennia. To help us indeed to reflect critically on how the term is currently understood, we must, I think, return to the longue durée, to return to this 2,000-year history of its contestation, as I'm arguing elsewhere with a colleague we should also do in many other areas of historical research. With that broad aim in mind, let me immediately offer 3 examples of how the term has been used over time to reveal some of the sedimented meanings and accumulated contestations that give rise to many of our own current confusions and discontents over civil war and its meaning. The first example comes from the 2nd century Greek historian of Rome's civil wars, Appian of Alexandria, writing in the 2nd century CE. Appian wrote that in the 80s BCE in Rome, the conflict between the competing generals Sulla and Marius was, quotes, "the first conducted in Rome not under the guise of civil dissension, but nakedly as a war, with trumpets and military standards. The episodes of civil strife," he continued, "escalated from rivalry and contentiousness to murder, and from murder to full-scale war. And this was the first army composed of Roman citizens to attack their own country as if it were a hostile power." That definition of civil war has particular value because it comes from an historian writing in Greek about Roman history, Greek being a language and a set of traditions which in fact contain no precise equivalent for the term civil war in the sense that the Romans, or I will argue we, understand it, a concept which again I will argue here is specifically and identifiably Roman in origin. It does not have a conceptual prehistory before the 1st century BCE. In the intellectual genealogy of civil war, as in so much else, all roads, it seems, lead back to Rome. My second example, just briefly, comes from the period when the Roman conception of civil war had, I believe, ceded primacy to a still more confused and contentious debate over the relations among such conceptions as revolution, rebellion, insurgency, and civil war. This definition comes from a character I've already briefly mentioned, the 19th century Prussian lawyer, America's first professor of political science, Francis Lieber, in 1863. When in the General Orders number 100 for the Union Army, he gave this definition of civil war. Civil war is war between 2 or more portions of a country or state, each contending for the mastery of the whole and each claiming to be the legitimate government. The term is also sometimes applied to war of rebellion, when the rebellious provinces or portions of the state are contiguous to those containing the seat of government. Hardly an elegant or concise definition, as you'll understand, but I've got an even worse one for you in just a moment, so hold on to your seats. Lieber strove to be neutral in this definition, which he composed in the middle of what we now know as the US Civil War, for inclusion in those famous General Orders number 100, the first formal codification of the laws of war at that point, generally known, as I mentioned, as the Lieber Code, though redescribed for us recently by John Witt as Lincoln's Code, where he has very convincingly articulated that in relation to the Emancipation Proclamation and fears not of civil war, but of servile war in the South in particular. Now, Lieber's definition of civil war, one of the very few things in the Lieber Code or Lincoln's Code that John does not pay very close attention to, it's rather distinct from his own thesis, really lacks any precedent in the legal literature that I can discover. I cannot find any prior definition of civil war in the traditions that Lieber would have been familiar with, or indeed any other traditions that bears any relation to his definition, which was pretty much created from whole cloth in the circumstances of the spring of 1863, and I will come back to that in just a second. Was also much more controversial and partisan a definition in its own time than Lieber ever publicly admitted. It also did very little to prevent later definitional controversy, even though he wanted to narrow the confines of the definition, and even though the Lieber Code itself became in due course, of course famously, the model for the Geneva and Hague Conventions, as well as for a succession of US Army field manuals in the 20th and 21st centuries, and I'll return to some of those in a moment. My third and last example of a definition of civil war comes from the American social scientists Melvin Small and David Singer, who in 1972 defined civil war as, quotes, sustained military combat, primarily internal, resulting in at least 1,000 battlefield deaths per year, pitting central government forces against an insurgent force capable of inflicting upon the government forces at least 5% of the fatalities the insurgents may sustain. This will be on the test for any students who are here, so I hope you've got all of those parts of the definition. That definition, as again I'll show more briefly in a moment, was the product of much debate and confusion among social scientists during the Cold War and decolonization about the difference between civil war and other kinds of, quotes, internal warfare, riot, rebellion, revolution, insurgency, for example. Every element of that definition was designed to secure the boundaries of the definition against imprecision. It had to be a war, for example, rather than any other kind of large-scale violence, such as a riot. It had to be internal to an existing state, but not exclusively so, in order to include those civil wars that drew in outside forces. It had to exclude one-sided massacres and genocides, and it left open the motivations of the participants, even as it implied that one side had legitimacy, the use of that term central government forces, while the other did not, the opponents being called an insurgent force within that allegedly neutral definition. Now, each of those three overlapping definitions, and I'll return to their contexts and what they betoken in a second, the first from the 2nd century, the second from the mid-19th century, the third from the late 20th century, can be taken to exemplify one broad era in the longue durée history of ideas of civil war. Appian's, what I would call the Roman, descriptive and historical conception of civil war, which was a product of 2 centuries of discussion among Roman historians, poets, orators, and jurists about Rome's own successive and repetitive conflicts. Lieber's definition was what I would call a Euro-American, normative, and fundamentally legal version, which he cut from whole cloth, but hoped might clarify some of the earlier confusions that a historicist vision had led to on the issue of what was or was not a civil war. And Small and Singer's definition more recently is what we might call an American definition, ultimately global in scope, empirical and social scientific in its ambitions and its origin, springing from a ferment among social scientists who wanted a definition in particular to help them to derive and corral large amounts of data. All three definitions have left their mark, I believe, on how we currently understand civil war, though each in its own time and since has been contentious and much argued over. To see why, let's now go back to Republican Rome for a moment, because for almost 1800 years, civil war would be seen through Rome-tinted spectacles. The Romans had a term for it, bellum civile, civil war, a deliberately paradoxical term that reflected the distance between our way of thinking about war and theirs in one crucial regard. While we in the West at least, generally call wars after the place where they were fought, think of the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, even perhaps the Second World War, the Romans usually named them after the enemy they were fighting. Thus, Rome fought 3 wars in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE against the Carthaginians, the descendants of the Phoenicians, or the Poini, hence the term Punic Wars. The second of them was fought against the Punic general Hannibal, and also became known therefore as the Hannibalic War. One can continue with many other similar examples. Who then were the enemy in a civil war? What could possibly be civil about a war when that adjective usually, in Latin as well as in English and other cognate languages, usually qualifies more benign, even sublime forms of human activity? Civil society, civil disobedience, even civil servants. The answer is that the enemies in Rome's civil wars were cives, or fellow citizens, within the bounds of a single self-recognizing political community. This crucially distinguished them from the stasis, the Greek, various forms of sedition and rebellion that divided the Greek polis, in which rupture was sometimes understood to be a war, a polemos, but where the community was generally conceived ethnogenetically, even perhaps what we might call racially with a tinge of anachronism, but not in terms of common legal or political status as citizens. I think that's the crucial divide in the broader sense between Greek conceptions of internal conflict and Roman conceptions, and why I'm telling mostly a Romanoid story, at least for 1800 years after the original Roman definition of bellum civile. That definition first appeared, or that usage of the term first appeared in Latin in the 1st century BCE. In Cicero's speeches, he seems to be the first to use it systematically, but presumably behind his usage lay vernacular usages as well for it to be comprehensible. It was merely one among many novel kinds of wars the Romans were facing in that period. There were the struggles against Rome's allies, or socii, in Italy, which became known as the Social War. Then there were the military efforts to put down slave revolts, such as that led most famously by Spartacus in 71 BCE, the so-called servile wars, or wars against slaves, and a very widespread language of servile war used in the run-up to the Civil War and during the Civil War itself harks back to those Roman servile wars, the wars against slaves. Preeminently, of course, there was the series of citizens' wars, slugged out over at least a century and a half from the conflicts of Sulla and Marius in the 80s, at least through the succession struggles after the death of Nero in 69 CE. In the context of Roman conceptions of both law and war, the term bellum civile was consciously oxymoronic. Rome's usual opponents in its wars were by definition enemies, or hostes, the literally hostile opposite of those who were bound into the community, or the civitas, as fellow citizens, or cives. A civil war was instead an armed contention between groups of those who should have been closest to each other, at least in political and legal status, but a conflict distinguished by the trappings of war, by drums and trumpets, standards and generals, with the prize in the conflict being control of the city of Rome itself. These were the peculiar marks of civil war, rather than those of mere sedition or tumult, for instance. Civil war represented the ultimate breakdown of the comity of the civitas, and hence an unsettling incursion of violence within the very pale of civility itself. The stakes for using the term bellum civile were therefore high. This might explain why Roman orators and writers seem to have used it only reluctantly, if at all, for some decades after it entered the Latin lexicon. Most notorious of all in avoiding it was the civil warrior and chronicler of civil war, Julius Caesar himself, who in fact uses the words bellum civile, or their analogues, only twice in his autobiographical history, and for instance never in that history, notoriously never in that history, describes the moment that would become one of Rome's greatest metaphorical legacies to the later repertoire of ideas of civil war, the moment where he crossed the Rubicon. That does not appear. He magically goes from one side of the river Rubicon, or the stream of the Rubicon as it was at that point, with his army in January 49, but doesn't describe that moment. If civil war was the war that dared not speak its name in the 1st century of its usage, then Caesar was the original master of denial, and this can be reproduced among many other Roman actors at the time. Although civil wars were battles for control of the city itself, they could not easily be distinguished from foreign wars for the Romans, because they spilled over to arenas throughout the Roman world and drew in actors ultimately from across the empire as well. The more widely Rome expanded its citizenship, for instance, the broader the ambit of civil war, again war between citizens, could become. And the longer the historical perspective on Roman history, the more cursedly inescapable did those civil wars seem. They were the great pivotal moments in an increasingly disorderly distribution of authority that formed a sequence in the writings of Roman historians and poets across a century and a half, from Sulla's first civil war to the contentions after the death of Nero, as well as the great transformation of a republic, or succession of republics, as some Roman historians have urged us to imagine, into a monarchical empire. Now, I could talk in more detail about those Roman narratives, but let me just give you one important example of the endurance of that Roman conception of successive, repeatable, seemingly inescapable cycles of civil war from Augustine's City of God, of course. Augustine, perhaps the last great Roman historian, drew upon Cicero, Sallust, and other Roman historians to show how Rome had been plagued by internal conflict from the fall of Carthage to the rise of Augustus. Rome's pagan history, he argued, had been a catalogue of those evils which were more infernal because internal, quanto interiora tanto miseriora, a series of civil or rather uncivilized discords, discordiae civiles, vel potius inciviles, as he put it. How much Roman blood was shed, how much of Italy was destroyed and devastated, he lamented, by the social war, the servile wars, and the civil wars. The contrast with that other city, the city of God, a civitas whose citizens were never at war with each other, could hardly have been greater. These conceptions of civil war from Rome's historians all the way through from, say, Sallust to Augustine in particular, would remain normative among Rome's heirs and successors in the broad Mediterranean world and its neo-European offshoots until the late 18th century. Inhabitants of those worlds would see their own internal troubles as the culmination, or perhaps even the repetition, of the sequence of similar wars that followed the pattern of the Roman civil wars and that played out across Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. Roman lessons seem to be amply confirmed by the patterns of internal violence that fractured nations and later states across late medieval and early modern Europe, which many saw at the time as recapitulating patterns of strife familiar from the ancient past and perhaps embedded in the very historic origins of some of these European communities. If Roman history had taught these contemporaries anything, it was that cycles of civil war, once begun, were likely to remain unbroken. Authors from at least Machiavelli through to Montesquieu and beyond authoritatively warned that there could in fact be no civilization without civitates, that is, cities or states, and it was the fate of those commonwealths or cities to be riven by civil strife. It is in vain to seek a government in all points free from a possibility of civil wars, warned the English aristocratic republican Algernon Sidney in the early 1680s. That, he said, is a blessing denied to this life and reserved to complete the felicity of the next. To be civilized was, in fact, to be capable of, but also fatally susceptible to, civil war. A narrative of the history of civilization structured around a sequence of violent upheavals is, of course, not unfamiliar to us. What is unusual is that the upheavals I've been describing so far were civil wars rather than revolutions. In finding the Roman sequence unsettling, perhaps, we find ourselves on the other side of a major conceptual shift that took place around the late 18th century, the period known at the time and since as the Age of Revolution, or the Age of Revolutions in the plural. It was in this moment the late conceptual historian Reinhard Koselleck noted that, quotes, civil war acquired the meaning of a senseless circling upon itself with respect to which revolution opened up a new vista. From that set of preconception, from that pivotal moment, we derive a set of preconceptions, perhaps even prejudices about the difference between revolution and civil war. Civil wars, we might think, are sterile and bring only destruction, while revolutions are fertile with innovation, transformative, even utopian possibilities. Civil wars are local and time-bound. Revolutions have, however, occurred across the world, an unfolding sequence of human liberation since 1789 or possibly 1776 or maybe 1688 or maybe 1649, depending where you begin that sequence. Civil wars, we might also think, mark the blighting and collapse of the human spirit. Revolutions, its unfolding and self-realization. Now, to conflate revolution with civil war often has counter-revolutionary connotations, thanks to the anti-utopian, destructive and retrograde implications of the term civil war itself. Yet historians are always aware that naming is framing. Revolutionaries rebranded what in other circumstances or by other ideologues had been called rebellions, insurrections, or civil wars, and rebranded them as revolutions. Indeed, we might say that one sure sign of a revolution's success is precisely that retrospective redescription as a revolution rather than a civil war. Perhaps the most successful example of a civil war that was rebranded as a revolution is the American Revolution. The term is a reminder that the struggle was fought between fellow Britons and their allies within the context of a single political community, the British Empire of the Atlantic world. The traditional historiography of the American Revolution until recently has, of course, long denied that the conflict should be seen as a civil war. To do so was generally thought to imply a loyalist or Tory perspective on the conflict as fought between groups of self-identified Britons rather than, as say, a nationalist uprising by insurgent Americans, already sure of themselves as distinct from their British brethren, as Thomas Jefferson famously called them in the Declaration of Independence. It was therefore a war of self-determination, not a civil war within the larger British Atlantic community. Yet, as I noticed when I was writing my book on the Declaration of Independence that Alison kindly mentioned, observers on both sides of the transatlantic debate freely used the language of civil war. As early as 1775, contemporaries were calling the conflict the American Civil War. And in July 1775, the Continental Congress issued its, quotes, declaration setting forth the causes and necessity of taking up arms, which Jefferson, of course, drafted, in which its members stated that, quotes, their aim was reconciliation on reasonable terms, thereby to relieve the empire from the calamities of civil war. The next declaration from the Continental Congress, a year later, almost to the day, in July 1776, showed that that time for reconciliation was long past. And the attempt to relieve the empire from the calamity of civil war now had to be replaced by an attempt, ultimately successful, to change rebels within the British Empire into belligerents outside it, with the announcement that the United Colonies were now free and independent states. The ultimate success of that declaration and the struggle of which it formed part, and also the cause that gave rise to it, led not just to formal independence, of course, for the former colonies after 1783, but also the transformation of that first American Civil War into the American Revolution, a term that's used briefly in 1776, only used officially in 1778, as far as I can find, by Congress itself, but then comes into broader political discourse on both sides of the Atlantic by the early 1780s, but a retrospective rebranding, I would insist. From a civil war rebranded as a revolution, I turn now to briefly to the Second American Revolution, better known as, of course, the American Civil War. By May 1861, all sides, Northern and Southern, American and British, foreign and domestic, had recognized the existence of a war within the boundaries of the United States. What kind of war was it, however? What rules should apply to its conduct? And again, this is what John Witt has so beautifully illuminated in his recent book. These questions went to the highest forum of the land, as you will recall, in February 1863, when the Supreme Court heard the arguments in the prize cases. All of those arose from Lincoln's order, President Lincoln's order in April 1861, to blockade ports from the Chesapeake Bay to the mouth of the Rio Grande on the grounds that the states of the Confederacy had, quotes, raised an insurrection against the government of the United States. That blockade and the subsequent use of prize law to distribute the proceeds from 4 captured ships applied the laws of war to a situation, the plaintiffs argued, in which no war had been declared, in which such laws therefore could not operate. The main question before the court was therefore whether there was indeed a state of war. Justice Robert Greer, writing for the majority, wrote that the call to call the action of the Confederacy an insurrection did not mean it could not also attain the status of a war. And that double-sidedness is very characteristic of many actors at this point. Nor could the absence of a declaration of war prevent the government in Washington, D.C. from treating rebels as belligerents. As he wrote, a civil war always begins by insurrection against the lawful authority of the government. A civil war is never solemnly declared. It becomes such by its accidents, the number, the power, and the organization of the persons who originate it and carry it on, for example. That momentous Supreme Court ruling, which I'm obviously truncating very brutally here to this fine point about the term civil war and its usage at this moment, opened the way for the first formal legal definition of civil war. The Union General and international lawyer Henry Halleck was the immediate source for the commission to Francis Lieber to produce his set of codified rules for land warfare. When Lieber sent his initial draft to Halleck in February 1863, Halleck objected that it lacked one crucial component, a definition of the peculiar kind of conflict in which the Union Army had been engaged in for over a year by that point. As he wrote in a letter to Lieber, quotes, "To be more useful at the present time, your code should embrace civil war, as well as war between states or distinct sovereignties." Lieber complained to Halleck that he could find no useful legal precedents to hand, and in a whining letter which has the kind of tone we recognize from some of our students, and we all wrote ourselves as students. He said, "I'm writing my 4 sections on civil war and invasion. Ticklish work that," and had nowhere to plagiarize from, no previous definition that he could give, so he had to create one of his own. Of course, according to Lieber's own definition, just to remind you, war between 2 or more portions of a country or state, each contending for the mastery of the whole, and each claiming to be the legitimate government. The American Civil War at that point was not a civil war at all, unless I missed something very fundamental about Confederate war aims. It may have been fought between 2 parts of the country, as he went on to show, but only one side, I think, aimed at overall mastery, or indeed claimed to be legitimate government over the whole territory of the United States. By Lieber's own reckoning, the Civil War was in fact a rebellion, as he defined it, quotes, "an insurrection of large extent, usually a war between the legitimate government of a country and portions or provinces of the same who seek to throw off their allegiance and to set up a government of their own." Indeed, Lieber admitted as much in the second half of his definition of civil war, sometimes applied to a war of rebellion, when the rebellious provinces or portions of the state are contiguous to those containing the seat of government. Hence, presumably, the official Union designation in the late 19th century of the conflict as the War of the Rebellion. That's the title of the, whatever it is, 60-volume plus official history of the war. Lieber's attempt at definitional precision was ultimately ineffectual. Indeed, the formal acceptance of the name Civil War for the conflict between 1861 and 1865 is, I think, remarkably recent. As far as I can discover, it was not until January 1907, in a congressional debate on war pensions for the Mexican War and the, quote, Civil War, that it was agreed formally, and after much heated discussion, that that conflict should be officially called the Civil War. As a Washington, D.C. newspaper reported the morning after the debate in Congress, quotes, "No more is to be heard of the War of the Rebellion, nor the war between the states. What General Butler once called in derision the late unpleasantness is henceforth to be known as the Civil War. The Senate so decided yesterday." Much more, of course, would be heard of all of those names, and a great many more. Indeed, by one count, there have been no fewer than 120 different names alleged for the defining conflict of US history. The US Army's field manuals, that I mentioned briefly before, the lineal descendants of the Lieber Code in many, many regards, offer a good index of indifference and indecision about the topic of civil war and its meaning. Apart from reprints of Lieber's Code, which came out, for instance, during the Philippine War, the first attempt since Lieber's that I can discover to define civil war in the formal documents of the US military appeared only in the Army's Field Manual for Military Operations in Low-Intensity Conflict as late as 1990, where it was defined in this way: a war between factions of the same country, and there are 5 criteria for international recognition of this status. The contestants must control territory, have a functioning government, enjoy some foreign recognition, have identifiable regular armed forces, and engage in major military operations. However, the first revision of the US Army's operational manual since 9/11, that was published in February 2008, and I think is still the normative definition for this, gave only a single paragraph in its 180 tightly packed pages to civil wars, noting only that they, quotes, often include major combat operations and can lead to massive casualties. It was almost as if all the civil wars around the world since 1989 had happened in a black box, beyond American military scrutiny or investigation. And indeed, for much of the 20th century, not just in the US, there remained something of a striking mismatch between the historical occurrence of what was called civil wars and the analytical attention that it attracted. As the German poet and commentator Hans Magnus Enzensberger noticed in 1990, quotes, "Civil war is not merely an old custom, but the primary form of all collective conflict." And yet, he continued, "It seems to be the exception to the rule, an irregular form of warfare. To this day, there is no useful theory of civil war." However, beginning in the 1960s, American social scientists became increasingly invested in the interpretation of what was broadly called internal warfare, a category encompassing everything from guerrilla warfare and insurgencies to civil wars, coups, and revolutions. The expansiveness of that definition of internal war generated anxiety about a lack of theoretical focus and a dissatisfaction that examples had become too heterogeneous to be codified or to be counted. Data could not be theorized, and theories lacked supporting data. It was to solve precisely that quandary that Melvin Small and David Singer generated the third definition of civil war I quoted earlier. Like other positivist social scientists of that moment, they demanded a quantitative rather than qualitative definition. to minimize subjective bias, as they put it, and more pointedly, to facilitate the construction of a data set as a means of getting out of what they call the conceptual morass of competing and inconsistent definitions of civil war derived from different areas of expertise, legal and political, as well as in general speech. Their definition, just to remind you, had a numerical cutoff, a set of boundary conditions, and a host of problems. Sustained military combat, primarily internal, resulting at least 1,000 battlefield deaths per year, pitting central government forces against an insurgent force, capable of inflicting upon government forces at least 5% of the fatalities that the insurgents sustain. That's still the reigning definition to this day, used by political scientists and others accumulating databases of civil wars, or indeed organizations like the ICRC and the World Bank attempting to decide whether or not a conflict is or is not a civil war. However, the greatest problem with that definition, or set of nested parts of the definition, surely is the number of conflicts it might not encompass. It would exclude many conflicts thought of by at least some participants and observers as civil wars. For example, the Swiss Sonderbund War of 1847, one of the shortest such wars on record, only 25 days long, which had one of the lowest death tolls, 93 people, I think, by the best count, but was still thought of at the time and since as a Bürgerkrieg, a civil war by all combatants and still in Swiss historical memory. Likewise, it might exclude the Troubles in Northern Ireland, for which the death toll was around 3,500 fatalities between 1969 and 2001, with an annual peak of only 479 in 1972. I say only because it doesn't reach that 1,000 threshold of 1,000 deaths, nor were those deaths in many cases definable as battle deaths. So even though many people at the time used the language of civil war to describe the Troubles in Northern Ireland, they would not be included in the formal definition of them. Moreover, the condition of being primarily internal, as the social science definition had it, was specified as being internal to the metropole in order quite deliberately to exclude post-colonial wars of national liberation and self-determination, in order to omit by design, for instance, the Algerian War, for example. For all its striving to be neutral and objective then, this idea of civil war, this definition of civil war, was in fact highly contingent and contestable. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, however, it was perhaps the worst definition of civil war one could imagine, except every other one that had been proposed over the last 2 centuries. All such attempts at precision are, I believe, as doomed as they are illusory, for the simple Nietzschean reason that civil war has too much history to be confined within any single definition, whether legal or political scientific, for instance. There's little indication for the moment that civil war will remain anything other than a contested category, as some of the debates around violence in Syria last year showed very clearly. When such conflicts flare up, the other powers of the earth may hedge their bets or decide that these wars are beyond their control because solely civil, that is, again, internal matters, as was the case in Iraq. The consequences of such decisions have been central to major conflicts across the centuries and around the world, as I've tried to suggest very briefly and episodically in this lecture so far. Was the American Revolution a revolution only for the American colonists, or was it a civil war within the British Empire? Still a very lively debate among historians who've recovered the loyalist viewpoint, for instance, with great rigor in recent years. Was the US Civil War a war between equal opposing parties, or instead a rebellion within the boundaries of a single sovereign state? Of course, a key gestalt problem, we might say, about the defining of the war at the time and for some parties since. More recently, did calling the conflicts in Rwanda and Bosnia civil wars allow the rest of the world to wash their hands of responsibility for what took place behind closed borders? And did naming what happened in Darfur genocide rather than civil war, for instance, render a fundamentally political conflict instead intractably ethnic, as Mahmoud Mamdani has argued, and hence beyond hope of reasonable resolution, it seemed? And of course, in international conflicts, in so-called international conflicts, conflicts between states, all the provisions of the Geneva Convention are held to apply to the combatants. In civil wars or non-international conflicts, such restraints are somewhat less stringent. For example, Common Article 3 of the Convention applies specifically to cases of armed conflict not of an international character, a slippery negative definition which has opened a great many loopholes. For example, in 1996, the International Criminal Tribunal ruled that the Bosnian War had mutated from an international war to a non-international war or a civil war in 1992, when the former Federal Republic of Yugoslavia had withdrawn its support from the ethnic Serbs. That ruling revealed how much can hang on the definition of a war as civil, In this case, whether a defendant could be held liable for breaches of the Convention and how flexible are the boundaries of humanitarian law even to this day. As the ICT asked in its ruling in the 1995 Tadic case arising from the Yugoslav war, why protect civilians from belligerent violence, or ban rape, torture, or the wanton destruction of hospitals, churches, museums, or private property, as well as prescribe weapons causing unnecessary suffering when two sovereign states are engaged in war, and yet refrain from enacting the same bans or providing the same protection when armed violence erupts only within the top territory of a sovereign state? Still a very good question to this day. The international institutions created in the last decade or so have endeavored to provide convincing answers to such urgent questions, building on the efforts of even earlier institutions such as the Red Cross, to apply the constraints that were becoming standard in conventional warfare to fighting in all wars, whether international or not international. These recent efforts to bring civil war, even that kind of conflict, within the pale of civility remain frustratingly and lethally incomplete. As the Yugoslav tribunal noted, there's been no full and mechanical transplant, as they put it, of the laws of war yet to civil warfare, nor could there be until all parties to such conflicts could agree to be bound by international humanitarian law. The choice of terms, therefore, has moral as well as political and legal consequences, and can be literally matters of life and death for tens of thousands of people, usually those least able to control how their own destinies are shaped, especially those in the global south. Because, I've argued, civil war is an essentially contested category, those who use it should be particularly aware of its history or its multiple histories. Any concept that straddles historical experience and theoretical disagreement, that straddles popular speech and also expert language, in this way is bound to be both seemingly precise, we know it when we see it allegedly, but otherwise frustratingly difficult to pin down. There might be two ways, at least, to respond to such ambiguity. One would be to try to recover some presumed essence of the term, to make its profusions of meaning somehow more manageable. The other, the one I preferred here, is to reconstruct its complexity to show just how it became so fraught with significance, danger, and contestation. We've already seen how attempts to confine civil war within a single definition lead only to further complication and further contestation. It might seem better then, I argue, to work from the other direction and to excavate the various meanings of civil war as they've been laid down over the centuries. Civil war is a category that must be understood in the realm of ideas that are both inherited and contested. And as I hope I've at least suggested briefly this evening, that conflict over its meaning, as much as the meaning of conflict, are prime subjects for genealogical and historical investigation. Thank you very much. And since that was a very question-begging talk, I'm very happy to beg for questions from the audience. If I've not stunned you into silence, sir, please.
I am not a student of law, but international relations theorist. That's what I'm preoccupied with. You didn't talk about cause. It was deliberate that you didn't talk about it, what causes the civil war in terms of internal conflict, because that's what it is, right? Civil war is internal conflict. I have here something for someone who came from Britain. It's 3 sentences. It is part of Jefferson Davis' speech from January 21, 1861. Advocacy of the right of a state to remain in the Union and to disregard its constitutional obligations by the nullification of the law. Nullification and secession, so often confounded, are indeed antagonistic principles. Nullification is a remedy which it is sought to apply between the Union and against the agent of the states. It is only to be justified when the agent has violated his constitutional obligation and a state, assuming to judge for itself, denies the right of the agent thus to act and appeals to the other states of the Union for a decision. But when the states themselves and when the people of the states have so acted as to convince us that they will not regard our constitutional rights, then for the first time arises the doctrine of secession in its practical application. I just marked it as two words, practical application. It's the cause of disagreement, right? Right in the Senate, in the US Senate. So I'm trying to connect two things. I mean, Marcus Aurelius, which is 180 BC, at the time when he died, and Commodus coming in, changing completely the law in books. At that time, the Senate, the Roman Senate, should be in charge, right? So he abolished all the laws established by the Senate and ruled for 12 years. You talk about the civil wars after 2 BC, right? 2 AD, right? After 200 AD. That was like the 100 years of civil wars, right? We had one here.
Let's give Professor Armitage a chance to
we had
respond
one
to
here.
the question.
Thank you.
I think your fundamental question was that why I didn't address the question of cause.
Right.
In order to ask about cause, you need to be clear what conflict you're trying to explain. And my aim was to show that we're not quite so clear about exactly what is a conflict that is a civil war as against another kind of violence, whether internal or otherwise, however that might be defined, and therefore questions of causality are not the ones I'm interested in. I'm interested in perhaps the causality of why the term is applied in particular conflicts, what tools are available linguistically, legally, politically, ethically to describe these conflicts. But just as you are not a student of law, nor am I a political scientist, and therefore causation in this particular context as an intellectual historian is not part of the project I'm engaged on, nor is it one that yet I can see would be illuminating for the kind of intellectual historical argument about conceptual changes in conceptual conflict that I'm dealing with, because it does have that assumption that we know it when we see it. We know what is a civil war, and therefore we know what conceptual analytical tools to apply to the question of causation. That's not the project on which I'm engaged. I'm well aware that's a project that other political scientists and international relations theorists are engaged upon. Part of my interest is in how did that come to be an agenda for political science and development economics. A large part of the explanation of that is not from the period of the 60s or the 70s, but from the period of the late 80s and early 1990s, where the question about causation often focused around whether civil wars were fundamentally ethnic in motivation, or whether other forms of explanation might, particularly economic explanation, might explain the incidence of civil war. So you'd be very well aware, for instance, of the literature on civil war as motivated by greed or grievance, for instance. I have no dog in that fight, but I'm very interested in how the fight was set up, who created the boxing ring, who set up the rules for adjudication of that fight, in order perhaps to render humble the political scientists in their certainty that they know what the conflict is and therefore how they might explain it. So I'm dodging your question because it's not the one I'm interested in, but it's one I would counsel a little more humility about, as some of the certainty perhaps of your fellow political scientists might imply about understanding what it is that they're trying to analyze when the boundaries may not be so clear and the definitions not be so precise or illuminating.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Alison, please.
So a question I have is about when the issue of recognition by some external country became, or nation became significant, because obviously as you've written, it's a big part of the American Revolution and the U.S. Civil War. So when does that enter into the, if not the definition, the practical application of Civil War?
I think that there are not, to my knowledge, moments of direct overlap between those two, that the term Civil War is constituted by external recognition in the way that, for example, statehood is constituted by external recognition. It's more the other way around. It's the recognition of the existence of a state termed to be civil war, which then draws certain boundaries to the application of the laws of war and humanitarian law in particular within a conflict, but then most often has consequences which are political and diplomatic in nature about policy by the external states. But the transformation, in particular, of certain conflicts from civil war to interstate war is the moment where that does become important. And so again, you've alluded to this already, the moment at which, for instance, the French make the Franco-American Treaty as a moment of external recognition, not then recognized by the other belligerent power in the conflict, Great Britain, changes the boundaries of the war, changes the meaning of the war for the American colonists as well as for their ally in that way. But still it's contested at that moment, and there's never a recognition by Britain in the context of the American Revolution that was ever an interstate war. 1783 is the moment where the war is held to have ceased and therefore new states to exist, but never was there a period of warfare between two contending states or sets of states on one side and another state. And that, of course, is the conceptual conundrum for the desire for recognition by the Confederacy as well, to get others to recognize that state. And of course the major efforts by Lincoln to prevent that from happening are a major motivational cause behind, again, as John Witt has shown very well, a major cause behind the deliberate conceptual obfuscation about the nature of the war that goes on in the Supreme Court, in the cabinet, in Lincoln's speeches about how this could both be a rebellion and a formal war without tipping over into acknowledging it as an interstate war, which would have recognized that division. So that's a long and tangled history, but it's mostly about statehood and maybe retrospective recognition that a civil war had been transformed into an interstate war, but not immediate recognition within the context of the conflict itself, to my knowledge anyway. Please.
Yeah, one of the things, of course, that's so characteristic about the American situation is that when they set up the Union to begin with, it was very unclear exactly what the status was of the states vis-a-vis the Senate on the question of withdrawal. And there were partnership examples which would say that essentially upon the pleasure to leave, you could go without cause, and then there were other people who said no, even though you came together that way, you could not depart in that way. And the question I'm just curious about, you referred to the privateers cases and so forth, the prize cases and so forth. To what extent did the early confusion and disagreements, which starts, I guess, with the Federalist Papers, if not before, carries through all the debates in the antebellum theory, influence the confusion that actually resulted when these cases were then litigated before the Supreme Court, the prize cases, or an ex parte merriment, or any one of the other things that took place during that period.
Well, I think even the quotation I gave you from Justice Greer showed that, again, that conceptual sleight of hand of the double nature of the conflict inevitably having to be acknowledged there. And again, there's a lot more evidence of that from the opinions in that case, as well as from even the Lieber Code itself, is that the passages I was quoting from the code itself show that ambivalence about exactly the nature of the conflict and how it has to be seen as double-edged, in some sense, both a police action by a legitimate state enforcing its authority over rebels on the one hand, yet not thereby allowing the rebels to treat the forces of the Union itself as if they too were guerrillas or other kinds of irregular warriors as well. So trying to regularize the conflict without denominating it as an interstate war is the crucial dilemma, and one that informs all of the public documents on that on that score. And behind that, obviously, is that longer set of arguments as well. So I think that's absolutely crucial. If you think of, again, something that Alison and I have been talking about for years, federalism itself as a treaty relationship, going back to even the very etymology of the term, going back to a foidus, again, all roads lead to Rome in this case as in others, to think about that as a treaty relationship. Is that an irreversible contract? Is it as David Henriksson and others have argued, was the federal union itself an international agreement as well as a security arrangement in its early basis, therefore was motivated by warfare and security concerns, but between parties who at least to some extent recognized each other as potentially independent international actors on a larger stage. I think that's the larger conceptual key to the American dilemmas, and we haven't told quite the story, or historians haven't yet quite told the story that you have sketched out, going from the 1780s through to 1863 along those sorts of lines. Again, as Alison and I were discussing before, we have this huge gap in the legal history of the early 19th century to be filled, which would give us some sense of that connection.
Just you mentioned and I'll just follow it up with one sort of simple observation. You mentioned the references to the Roman history, the Roman Senate, and so forth. And one of the things that I do is teach Roman law, and I'm going to make the reference to the Roman law of partnership, which essentially was that there was virtually no way that you could make a partnership binding against the will of some of the people to remove from it, right? And in fact, when they talked about death dissolving a partnership, the thing, when it continued on, had to be done with the fresh consent of all the parties in there. So the question is, if you take that as a reference point and a baseline, does that suggest that Calhoun and company actually had the better of the argument on textual grounds, even though they may have had the worst of the argument in terms of the political realities of the day? I mean, I don't wish to be a champion of slavery in making this question, but I do want to ask the question as to whether or not well, part of the reasons why they were so ambivalent on the part of the Northerners, right, is that they knew deep down that on the legal side they were probably on the weaker half of the argument.
This is where I'm going to plead my British citizenship and back out of extremely controversial arguments. So, as my friend reminded me here, I'm British and coming from the outside here. But
I'm just curious. I mean, because you do, you know, across the sweep. I find it. I mean, I've tried to figure out the other side of this argument. I think on balance, this one actually comes a little bit better, unless there's something fundamentally different about state relationships rather than individual relationships. And if I would have thought anything, the difference would cut the other way. That the autonomy of states sort of give it a kind of preemptory quality, which we often don't grant to individual persons.
So, let's go back to the founding father here, as the real founding father, as Thomas Hobbes would remind us. One of the major fundamental differences between international persons and individual persons is international persons cannot die in the same way. And of course, we know that states are born and they die in large numbers, and have done since the early 19th century. But that sense of the continuity, and refer back to Roman law again, to refer to the eternity of the corporation, is something I think we as historians have not investigated how deeply embedded that is in our conception of statehood, of states as corporations as the genus of which states are one species, and one way in which you can tell that is that idea of the eternity of the state itself, that it does not die, that it has continuity, eternal continuity, in the same way that the corporation emerging from ideas of Roman law also has that kind of continuity. You want another follow-up?
Every piece of state of nature theory that you have involved upon is individuals to the state. I can't think of a single reference which actually try to talk about how states form federations. So the query is the extent to which you could carry this over. Maybe the Lockean work with respect to what he did in South Carolina.
Well, we can talk about that afterwards. There are other interesting dimensions to that, about treaty relations with indigenous peoples, those outside conception of as it were, a civilized social contract. But there's a lot more to be said about that. But please, yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering this. So you opened with this observation that naming is framing, and it seems like much of what you're describing for much of this period is about retroactive sort of rebranding of wars as civil wars, which certainly has political, intellectual, cultural connotations that seem really important. There's something, it seems to me, distinctive about what you're describing in the contemporary period, which is that the naming actually carries
Yes.
legal connotations
Yes.
that will influence the way the war itself is fought.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you would differentiate
Mhm.
between these two moments where you see that dividing line taking place and what significance you think it has.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's absolutely right. I mean, what I'm trying to sketch here, and I think I mentioned it extremely briefly, is some periodizations in the ways in which civil war is thought about. So a broadly historicist version arising from Rome, what we would recognize now as a continuous legal tradition beginning around the time of Liber. I think that the Liber Code is a crucial aspect of the legal definition of civil war, specifically, though, of course, legal foundations to the Roman definition in itself at the very beginning, and then also the subsequent layering onto a conception of historical memory and historical sequence and historical causation of civil wars. That layered over with legal definitions, and finally layered over with social scientific definitions, which is mostly where in the realm of expertise, we get definitions of civil war now. There's one realm of expertise, which is legal expertise, especially in international humanitarian law, which is quite distinct from, but often connected politically to the social scientific definitions as well. It's only when the ICRC has run the numbers from basically that Singer and Small definition, have we reached 1,000 battle deaths within a defined period, that you reach the threshold of civil war, and once that threshold is reached, then can the ICRC finally denominate a conflict as a civil war, which then triggers humanitarian law. So I think that's the situation that we've got to now of popular memory or popular intuition of what a civil war looks like often runs very far ahead of the legal definition, which is based upon the social scientific definition. So it's often interesting to see that happen in Iraq, and then to see this repeated quite recently, in 9 months ago, in Syria as well, that long process. I mean, I could give you a lot of quotations from just over a year ago, maybe 15 months ago or so in Syria, of people on the ground saying, we are dying here, this is a civil war, there's no doubt about it, which are exactly the same as the kinds of quotations, harrowing quotations one got from Iraq in the same period, as the politicians and the lawyers and the political scientists were fighting about whether or not it was a civil war. So that gap between popular intuition and the language of expertise, I think, is a very interesting one to investigate, because it's the layering of the social scientific, the legal, the popular memory, which goes into this and creates the confusion and a great deal of the anguish, as well as those who are being bombed in places like Homs, for instance, a year ago, are pleading for not just external intervention or support, but also for the application of international humanitarian law, and the ICRC saying, we're still counting, we're waiting till we get across the threshold. This is something which has real world consequences in terms of those definitions, but it's partly the layering and the competition and the sequencing of those definitions, which I think is so revealing but also harrowing about the situation we've got ourselves into, and why I think this kind of genealogical approach, or maybe even slightly archaeological approach, of going down through the layers to see where these definitions came from and how they've come to coincide with each other, is so important for this, as it is, for example, in the parallel case of genocide, for instance, as well, where the triggering conditions, legal consequences as well as political consequences that come from the application of the term, which raises the threshold and it decreases the likelihood of the application of the term, thereby perhaps in many cases leading to more bloodshed, more destruction than might be the case if some of the definitions were relaxed, or the intuitions of people on the ground were preferred against legal definitions. But then there are all questions about why those sorts of normative definitions have to be deployed, because then they open up so many other sorts of consequences. So that's a great question, and one that I'm really trying to tackle as we bring this story up to the present. I mean, I'm trying to finish the book, but every time I get to the point of it, another conflict and another set of these determinations, sadly, bitterly, comes along. But I think that's part of the interest of the project, that we're facing these dilemmas cumulatively and repetitively, without clarity, which I've said I don't think is ever going to be achieved, but without also humility about how we've got into this fix now through the competition and the layering of these different languages, both expert and non-expert. So thank you.
Continue the conversation at a reception outside, and thank Professor
Thank you. Thank you.